The wind didn't howl. It sliced. It carved across the Montana plains in the winter of 1869, a relentless blade of ice that turned the world into a featureless, white hell. Into this silence walked a woman, a solitary figure of dark wool against the endless expanse of snow. Annabelle Sinclair clutched her shawl, the fibers doing little to stop the cold from seizing her lungs. Her boots were leaden weights, each step a struggle through the deep drifts toward the only sign of life, for miles. The dark, hulking silhouette of a ranch house. Before her numb knuckles could strike the heavy door, it groaned open. A man filled the doorway, his frame blocking the weak light from within. His eyes, the color of riverstone, assessed her with an unnerving stillness. The lines on his face were deep, carved by more than just weather. His coat hung open, revealing a worn revolver on his hip, and on his left hand a simple gold wedding band. "I'm Annabelle Sinclair," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "The Missouri Matrimonial Agency sent me. I am to marry a Mr. Carter." The man blinked a slow, deliberate motion. "My name is Colt Rafferty. I didn't order a bride." A gust of wind shoved at her back, but she held her ground. There must be a mistake. The letter said, Red Bluff Ranch. "This is Red Bluff," he replied, his voice flat. "But there's no Carter here." He began to shut the door. "Please," Annabelle said, the word tearing from her throat. "The stagecoach is gone. The storm. I have nowhere else to go." He hesitated, his gaze flicking over her shoulder to the blinding white fury gathering on the horizon. A fraction of a second, then, he stepped aside. "For the night," he said. The warmth inside was a physical blow, thawing her frozen skin and stirring a deep ache in her bones. The main room was sparse, a stone fireplace, holding a struggling fire, rough-hewn furniture and walls that seemed to absorb sound. Her small trunk looked out of place by the door. Her eyes caught on a child's bonnet, hanging next to a rifle, a small wooden horse abandoned near the hearth, and on the mantel, a woman's portrait, half-dusted. Colt followed her gaze. "She passed 3 years ago," he stated the words, stripped of all emotion. "My wife." "I didn't come to replace anyone," Annabelle said softly. He just motioned to a hallway. "You can sleep there tonight." She nodded, turning to go, when a soft sound stopped her. Bare feet on floorboards. A small figure emerged from the shadows of an adjoining room, a girl no more than 5 in a faded nightdress. Her dark hair a tangled mess around a pale, too serious face. Colt went utterly still. The child walked directly to Annabelle, her wide eyes fixed on her. Small cold fingers reached out and clutched the rough wool of Annabelle's skirt. The girl looked up, and in a voice that was little more than a breath broken from disuse, she whispered, "God finally sent you to us." The air vanished from the room. Colt took a sharp step forward. "Emmy." The child didn't look at him, her grip on Annabelle tightening. "She hasn't spoken," Colt murmured, his voice thick with something between awe and agony. "Not since." Annabelle knelt, bringing herself to the girl's eye level. "Hello, sweetheart," she said gently. "My name is Annabelle." The girl's lips trembled. "Are you going to leave too?" The question was a knife to Annabelle's heart. She touched the child's cold cheek. "No," she said. "Not tonight." Colt stood rigid, his hands clenched at his sides, his gaze locked on the two of them. When he finally spoke, the cold edge was gone from his voice, replaced by a raw, weary surrender. "Stay," he said. "At least until the storm passes." Annabelle nodded, but a deeper instinct told her the real storm had just begun, and she was already at its center. The blizzard did not break. It settled over the land like a death shroud, piling snow into impassable drifts and sealing the ranch in a profound silence. Days bled together. Colt spoke little, his communication a series of gruff, functional statements. Yet his actions were quietly attentive, extra wood on the fire before she woke a drafty window in her room, nailed shut the cracked handle of the kettle repaired after he saw her struggle with it. Emmy began to orbit Annabelle, a silent, watchful moon. She'd leave small offerings, a clumsily folded drawing of 3 stick figures under a yellow sun, the word Mama scrawled above them, a plate of lopsided, half-burnt biscuits. Annabelle received each gift as if it were a treasure, and slowly a tiny, unsure smile began to grace the girl's face. One afternoon, as Annabelle read from a worn Bible on the porch, Emmy climbed into her lap and curled there, as if it were her rightful place. Inside, through the window, Colt watched them. He didn't smile, but the relentless tension in his shoulders seemed to ease just for a moment. The fragile piece was a thin veneer. In the guest room wardrobe, Annabelle found a faded blue dress, its lace fine, its stitching careful. It hung there like a ghost, and on the coldest nights when the wind screamed, the sound was too much like a memory she'd spent years trying to forget. The snow continued to fall, a silent, relentless siege that turned days into a hazy dream of firelight and shared solitude. The ranch house, once a tomb of memories, began to breathe again. The scent of baking bread now mingled with the smell of wood smoke, and the quiet was no longer empty, but patiently waiting. Colt remained a man of few words, but his silence had changed. It was no longer a wall, but a watchful presence. He began to include her in the rhythm of the day, not with an invitation, but with an expectation. He'd leave the coffee pot warm on the stove. He'd rest the harness he was mending on the table near her chair, a silent request for her to hold the leather steady while he worked the awl through the tough hide. They spoke through tasks a language of shared labor that felt older and truer than words. One morning he caught her staring at the piano in the parlor, her fingers hovering just above the dusty lid. Eleanor played. He said the name, hanging in the air between them. It was the first time he'd said it. Haven't heard it since. He didn't look at her as he said it, busying himself with stacking logs by the hearth, but the offering was clear. Emmy was the thread stitching them together. Her trust in Annabelle became a tangible thing. She'd fall asleep in Annabelle's lap by the fire, her small body a warm, trusting weight. She began to mimic Annabelle, trying to braid her doll's hair the same way Annabelle braided hers. The silence she held was no longer fearful, but contemplative. The change in Colt was subtler, visible only in the details. The photograph on the mantel was finally dusted, the frame polished with a careful hand. He'd watch Annabelle with Emmy, his gaze not cold and assessing, but weary, and wondering, as if he was witnessing a miracle he didn't dare believe in. One afternoon, the weak sun broke through the clouds. Colt wordlessly lifted Emmy onto the back of a gentle chestnut mare, his large hands sure and steady on her small back, as he led the horse in a slow circle around the yard. Annabelle leaned against the fence, the cold wood biting through her gloves, and watched the impossible scene, the grim man, the silent child, and the first glimpse of a thaw she felt deep in her own frozen heart. That night the wind returned with a vengeance, a full-throated blizzard that shook the window panes. Annabelle, forgetting her own coat, dashed outside for a bucket. The cold was a physical assault, stealing the breath from her lungs. Before she could retreat, Colt was there, his own heavy coat being draped over her shoulders, his hands briefly brushing her neck as he adjusted the collar. "You'll freeze," he murmured, his voice rough against the howl of the wind. Their faces were close snow catching in his lashes. In the stark white light, she saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the years of grief etched into his face, but also a new raw openness that made her breath catch. "Thank you," she whispered, the words torn away by the gale. Back inside, standing before the fire, the coat still wrapped around her, something shifted. Emmy slept in the rocking chair, her doll clutched to her chest. The world outside was chaos, but in this room, a fragile golden peace held firm. "I met her at a fair." Colt set his eyes on the sleeping child. "Eleanor. She always wore blue." A faint ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Said I walked in my boots like a stiff-legged ox." He looked down at the ring on his finger, turning it slowly. "I keep this on, because I'm afraid if I take it off, I'll forget the sound of her laugh." Annabelle's hand moved without her conscious thought coming to rest lightly on his chest over the steady beat of his heart. Maybe she'd want you to remember something else, now she said softly. Not just her voice, but the way she loved you. And how much you still have left to give. He looked at her, truly, looked at her, and the vulnerability in his gaze was terrifying and beautiful. I don't know how he admitted the confession costing him dearly. You do, she replied, her voice unwavering. You already are. His hand came up hovering just beneath hers, not touching, but close enough to feel the heat of his skin. The storm outside meant nothing. The past, for one fleeting moment, loosened its grip. He was not a ghost, and she was not a visitor. They were just two people finding a way to be unbroken together. The next day, while changing the sheets on Emmy's bed, Annabelle's hand brushed against a piece of paper tucked beneath the pillow. It was another of the child's drawings, but this one was different. The lines were frantic, jagged. A woman with yellow hair was being dragged away by a large, shadowy figure with thick arms. On the ground beside them, another stick figure lay motionless. Above him, 3 crooked, desperate words were scrawled. Pie's sleep. A cold dread, deeper than any Montana winter, seeped into Annabelle's bones. The jagged lines of the drawing seemed to burn in Annabelle's memory. That evening, she waited until Colt had finished oiling the hinges on the back door, the rhythmic squeak and silence the only sound in the quiet house. She approached him, the folded paper held out in her trembling hand. He took it. His work-roughened fingers careful against the crude sketch. His eyes scanned the frantic lines once then again, more slowly. He didn't speak. He simply sat down on the edge of a nearby chair, the wood groaning under his weight, his gaze fixed on the image of the fallen figure and the 3 damning words. She draws a lot, he finally said, his voice a low, flat echo in the room. But not like this, Annabelle replied, her own voice barely a whisper. He gave a single slow nod, more to himself than to her. The air between them grew heavy and cold, the warmth from the hearth suddenly insufficient. Annabelle gathered her courage, the question hanging between them like a blade. Colt, what happened to your wife? He was silent for a long time, his elbows on his knees, his hands dangling between them. When he spoke, each word was dragged from a deep, dark place. I was drunk that night. He swallowed hard. We'd argued. I don't even remember what about. She went upstairs with Emmy. I stayed by the fire, drank until I passed out. He paused, the memory of physical pain on his face. I woke the next morning. What did you wake to? Annabelle prompted gently. His eyes were hollow, seeing a scene she could not. Blood. On my shirt. On the floorboards near the back door. Eleanor was gone. So was her coat. He rubbed his temples as if trying to press the memory out. The sheriff came, asked questions. No body. No note. Just gone. They called it a disappearance. And you? She asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. What do you believe? His jaw clenched, a muscle twitching. I don't know. The admission was ripped from him. I've tried to remember. Prayed for a dream, a flash, anything. But there's nothing. Just the hangover and that damn blood. The silence that followed was thicker than the falling snow outside, suffocating in its implication. Annabelle felt the fragile trust they'd built begin to crack. Why didn't you tell me? She whispered. He finally looked up at her, his gaze stark and honest. Would you have stayed if I had? She had no answer. The truth was she didn't know. A few days later, under the pretense of needing air, Annabelle walked through the deep snow to the edge of the woods, where a small dilapidated cabin stood, smoke struggling from its chimney. Mrs. Hargrove answered her knock, a widow wrapped in a thin shawl, one eye milky and blind, a long scar tracing down her neck. She peered at Annabelle with her good eye. Colt Rafferty's woman, she stated it wasn't a question. I am staying with him, Annabelle said cautiously. I need to know about that night, 3 years ago. Did you hear anything? See anything? The old woman grunted, rocking back on her heels. Heard a scream, around midnight, sharp like a fox in a trap. She looked away, her voice dropping. My husband was already cold in the ground. I don't go looking for trouble in the dark. She paused, her gaze distant. Next morning I saw 'em. Footprints in the snow, leading from their place down toward the ridge. Annabelle's breath caught. Just one set. 2, the old woman replied, her good eye locking with Annabelle's. But only one came back. The world tilted. You told the sheriff. A bitter smile touched Mrs. Hargrove's lips. Sheriff was Colt's cousin. Didn't want no scandal. Told me to keep my mouth shut. So I did. Her voice softened with a regret that had festered for years. But I always felt that boy deserved the truth, even if he was too broken to go looking for it himself. Annabelle stood in the freezing doorway, the wind pulling at her cloak. 2 sets of footprints. Only one returned. The sheriff was his cousin. The past wasn't just sleeping. It was a buried truth waiting to be unearthed, and the child in the house held the key. The fragile peace shattered on a brittle afternoon. Colt was mending a fence line far to the south, a dark speck against the endless white. Annabelle stood in the doorway, squinting against the glare when she saw him, a rider materializing from the tree line, his horse moving with the weary plod of a long journey. As he dismounted, the set of his shoulders triggered a primal alarm in her. He was dust-covered and worn, but there was a coiled familiarity in his posture that made her blood run cold. "Can I help you?" she asked, stepping forward to block the doorway. The man removed his hat. His face was weathered into a permanent scowl, his eyes like chips of rusted iron. "Name's Danner," he said, his voice a low gravel. "Used to work this place. Heard Colt might still be here." Annabelle nodded slowly, her throat tight. A small movement beside her, Emmy had come to the door, her small hand slipping into Annabelle's. But the moment the girl's eyes landed on the man, her entire body went rigid. A silent, terrified freeze. Then she was gone, a blur of motion vanishing into the dark interior of the house. Annabelle called after her, but it was too late. She turned back to Danner, her voice turning to ice. "He's out back." Danner nodded, his gaze lingering on the empty doorway where the child had been before he started around the side of the house. Inside, Annabelle found Emmy curled into a tight ball beneath the bed in the guest room, her small frame shaking uncontrollably. "Sweetheart, what is it?" Annabelle pleaded, kneeling. Emmy didn't speak. Her hand shot out from under the bed, grabbing a piece of charcoal from a sewing basket. Frantically, desperately, she began to scrape on the wooden floorboards. The same jagged lines. The woman, the shadowy figure, the blade, the blood. It was all there, drawn not in pencil, but in pure, terrified trauma. Annabelle's heart seized. She stood, her purpose now crystalline and cold. She moved quickly to the fireplace, her hand reaching for the rifle mounted above the mantel. The door slammed open. Danner stood there, his eerie calm now gone, replaced by a sharp, dangerous focus. His eyes locked onto the drawing on the floor, then snapped to her. "She remembers, don't she?" he said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. Annabelle stepped back, the rifle stock cold in her hands. "You killed her." He smiled, a hollow, terrifying gesture. She wasn't supposed to be there. Neither was the kid. He took a step forward, a long knife appearing from beneath his coat as if by magic. "But your man Colt, he was too deep in drink to see straight. Made it easy. Another step. Can't risk her talking now." Annabelle swung the rifle up, but he was faster, a viper strike. He knocked the barrel aside, the weapon clattering across the floor. She turned to run, to put herself between him and the child under the bed, but he caught her arm, his grip like iron. He shoved her hard, sending her crashing to the floor. The world spun. She looked up as he raised the knife. A blur, a scream of pure, unadulterated terror. "Emmy." The child launched herself from the hallway, a small fury of fear, throwing herself at the man. No, Annabelle twisted, using the last of her strength to roll to cover the girl with her own body, just as the knife came down. The pain was instant and blinding, a searing heat that bloomed across her ribs, soaking her dress in a shocking warm flood. She collapsed, the coppery tang of blood filling her mouth. Annabelle. Colt's roar filled the house. The deafening crack of a rifle shot shattered the air. Danner stumbled backward, clutching his side shock etched on his face. Colt advanced, his face a mask of storm fury, the rifle steady in his hands. He kicked the knife away from Danner's reach and dropped to his knees beside Annabelle. His hands went to the wound, applying pressure, his face pale. "Stay with me," he said, his voice hoarse and fractured. Annabelle's vision swam. Emmy crawled to her side, small hands patting her face, sobbing uncontrollably. Then through the choking tears and gasps came the sound that shattered the last of the silence. A word screamed from a place of ultimate fear. Mama Emmy screamed, clinging to Annabelle's arm. "Mama, don't go." Colt froze, his eyes flying to his daughter's face, then back to Annabelle's. The truth of it, the raw, undeniable truth in that single word, finally broke him. Outside neighbors, drawn by the gunshot, began to arrive. A former deputy took one look at Danner and understood. The story unraveled quickly, with Emmy's trembling points and whimpers, and the neighbor's own recalled whispers of a scream on the wind years ago. Danner was dragged away, his secret finally exposed. But in the house, nothing mattered, except the fever that took hold. Annabelle drifted in a haze of pain, her skin burning, her breaths shallow. Colt never left her side. He mopped her brow, whispered her name, his own guilt, a heavier weight than any physical burden. Once, when the fever broke for a moment, her eyes fluttered open and found his. "You stayed," she whispered. "I never should have let you get hurt," he choked out, his voice raw. A faint smile touched her lips. "Worth it," she breathed. For her. From the doorway, Emmy tiptoed in. She climbed onto the bed, a damp cloth in her small hand, and placed it gently on Annabelle's forehead, mimicking what she'd seen her father do. Then she looked at Colt, her eyes ancient and knowing. "She's my mama now," the little girl whispered. And Colt, broken and breathless, could no longer deny the truth. He leaned down, pressed his lips to Annabelle's bloodless hand, and gave voice to the feeling that had been growing in the silence all along. "You saved us both." The morning sun broke over the snow-blanketed ranch, its light catching the ice crystals in the air and setting them ablaze. Inside, the house held a quiet, steady warmth. The fire crackled in the hearth, a pot of soup simmered on the stove, and the soft, even breathing of a child filled the space. Emmy lay curled beneath a heavy quilt beside Annabelle, her small fingers still tightly woven with hers, as if even in sleep she feared letting go. Colt stood by the window, his broad shoulders outlined against the bright morning. He watched the horizon, not with the weary tension of before, but with a new resolve, a peace that had settled deep into his bones. The ghosts had been laid to rest. The truth had been a brutal key, but it had finally unlocked the door to their future. After a simple breakfast, he turned to them. "Let's take a walk," he said, his voice quiet but firm. They bundled against the cold, stepping out into a world reborn in white. The sun cast long golden shadows, and the only sound was the crunch of their boots in the pristine snow. Emmy walked between them, a small, solemn figure holding both their hands. At the creek, now frozen and silent under a sheet of ice, Colt stopped. He turned to face them, the vast open sky behind him. "I've been thinking," he began, his gaze moving from Annabelle to Emmy and back again, "about what makes a family." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small velvet pouch. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he loosened the drawstring. Inside was a ring, simple and worn, its metal warmed by his touch. "I wore this for too long," he said, holding up his left hand where his wedding band still sat. He looked at it for a long moment, a final silent farewell to the woman he had loved and lost. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he slid the ring from his finger and held it in his palm. "She's gone, and I loved her. But loving her doesn't mean I stop living." His eyes found Annabelle's, and in them was a vulnerability she had never seen before, raw and honest. "Emmy needs a mother," he said, his voice softening. "And I need you." Tears welled in Annabelle's eyes, blurring the stark beauty of the winter landscape. "Family isn't about where we come from." Colt said, his words clear and sure in the cold air. "It's about where we choose to stay." Then he dropped to one knee in the snow, the gesture both humble and profound. He held up the ring, a golden promise against the white. "I choose you, Annabelle Sinclair. Will you marry me?" For a moment, there were no words. The only sound was the wind sighing through the pine boughs. Then Annabelle sank to her knees beside him, her arms wrapping tightly around Emmy, who pressed close between them. "I'm sorry," Annabelle whispered into the child's dark hair, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry I made you think I didn't want you." Emmy clung to her. "I knew you did," the little girl whispered back. "I just got scared." Annabelle turned her tear-streaked face to Colt, her hand still resting protectively over Emmy's back. "I was sure I'd missed my chance to be part of something whole," she confessed, "that I was only good at leaving." Colt reached for her free hand, his grip strong and sure. "But you stayed," he said. A sob and a laugh escaped her lips at once. "And so will I." She nodded, the movement sending tears tracing down her cheeks. "Yes, Colt. Yes, I'll marry you." He slid the ring onto her finger. It was warm from his hand, a perfect fit. It was his wife's ring, but it carried a new promise, now for a new future. 1 week later, the small church at Fort Banner opened its doors. The townsfolk filled the pews, their faces offering warm smiles and silent blessings. They had all heard the story of the woman who had bled to protect a silent child, and the man who had found his heart again in the midst of a Montana winter. Simple wildflowers, bravely pushing through the thawing earth, lined the aisle. Colt stood at the altar in his best shirt, his hands clasped tightly, a nervous energy radiating from him. Then, the doors opened. Annabelle walked in wearing a simple blue dress borrowed from the town's seamstress, her hair pinned with sprigs of dried lavender. But it was the small figure beside her who captured every heart. Emmy, proud and beaming in a clean blue dress, walked ahead, scattering petals from a small basket with a joy that was utterly contagious. When the preacher asked who gave this woman to be married, a clear, confident voice rang out without a moment's hesitation. "I do." Laughter warm and understanding filled the chapel. Colt's eyes found his daughter's, and the love and pride shining in them was a brighter light than any the sun could offer. After the vows, after the kiss, and after Emmy threw her arms around them, both the three of them walked out of the church together into the sunlight. They were no longer three separate souls bound by grief, but one family united by a grace that had been hard-won and dearly earned. That night, as the fire burned low and Emmy slept peacefully between them in the big bed, Annabelle stared at the ceiling, a sense of quiet wonder filling her. Colt's hand found hers over the quilt. "I wasn't born to be a mother," she whispered into the darkness. "But I was called to become one. And in the house where so much had been lost, something profound and beautiful had finally been found."